In the year 272, as dust settled over the battlefield near Antioch, a woman who had ruled an empire stretching from the Nile to the Bosphorus stood among the wreckage of her ambitions. Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, had challenged Rome itself and lost. But as her captors approached, she faced a fate that historians would describe as more devastating than any executioner's blade. What Rome did to defeated queens wasn't simply punishment. It was erasure, a methodical dismantling of identity so complete that crowns became chains and rulers became warnings. This is the story of how the world's most powerful empire perfected the art of breaking those who dared wear rival crowns. And what you're about to discover will reshape everything you thought you knew about ancient warfare. The Roman approach to captured royalty wasn't born from sadistic impulse. It was engineered through centuries of legal doctrine and military tradition. To understand the terror that awaited defeated queens, we must first grasp a fundamental truth that Roman law carved into stone. The moment your army fell, you ceased to exist as a person with rights. You became something else entirely. Roman legal scholars developed a concept they called jus gentium, the law governing relations between peoples. Within this framework lay a principle so absolute it shaped the fate of millions. Military defeat transformed free human beings into property. Not metaphorically, legally. A queen who commanded legions one day could wake the next morning as chattel, her royal lineage no more relevant than the jewelry she once wore. Consider what this meant in practice. Roman citizens lived under an intricate web of protections. The law shielded them from arbitrary punishment, from torture, from execution without due process. To publicly flog a Roman citizen was scandalous enough to end political careers. To execute one without trial could spark riots. These weren't just customs, they were enshrined rights that separated civilization from barbarism in the Roman mind. But cross that invisible line from citizen to captive, and every protection vanished. Foreign prisoners, regardless of whether they had ruled kingdoms or commanded respect across continents, found themselves in a legal void. They could be beaten, displayed, sold, or killed based entirely on the whims of their captors. And here's the chilling part: Roman law made no distinction for gender. None for nobility. None for the crowns that had once adorned their heads. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code, dating back 5 centuries before the Common Era, established these principles with language that left no room for interpretation. Where captives became state property, distributed among soldiers like any other plunder. A captured queen discovered that her authority, her lineage, her very identity held no weight once Roman chains replaced her crown. What had taken generations to build could be dissolved in a single day of defeat. Tacitus, one of Rome's most penetrating historians, documented this harsh reality when recording the conquest of Britain. He noted with disturbing matter-of-factness how Roman officials showed zero hesitation in degrading those who had previously administered justice and commanded armies. The implication was clear. Former power made captivity more humiliating, not less brutal. But there was another layer to this nightmare. Female captives faced vulnerabilities that went beyond legal status. Roman military culture, forged through endless campaigns across 3 continents, viewed captured women through a lens that modern observers would find appalling. While some high-ranking prisoners might be housed in relative security while negotiations proceeded, the vast majority faced immediate degradation. The theoretical distinction between prisoner of war and slave existed only in legal texts. On the ground in military camps far from Senate oversight, defeat dissolved all former status. Captured queens found themselves vulnerable to treatment that would have been absolutely unthinkable had they possessed citizenship. And Rome knew it. This wasn't a flaw in their system, it was a feature. The terror of what awaited defeat served as a weapon more powerful than any legion. Now, if you think this legal vulnerability was the worst of it, you're about to discover how Rome transformed military victory into public theater, with captured royalty as the main attraction. When a Roman general achieved a decisive military triumph, he could petition the Senate for the ultimate honor, a triumphus, a procession through Rome itself that turned warfare into spectacle. These weren't simple victory parades. They were carefully orchestrated displays of dominance that could take a full day to complete, winding nearly 4 kilometers through the heart of the city. And at the center of every triumph walked the defeated. The procession followed a formula perfected over centuries. First came musicians, their instruments announcing the arrival of conquest. Behind them rolled wagons bearing paintings of distant lands, architectural models of conquered cities, treasures looted from foreign temples. Romans who would never leave Italy could gaze upon representations of worlds their legions had subdued. Then came exotic animals, lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, elephants from distant kingdoms, all chained and paraded as symbols of Rome's reach. But the crowds weren't waiting for animals. They were waiting for the prisoners. Captured enemies marched in shackles through streets packed with spectators, but the procession saved the most powerful positions for royalty. Defeated kings and queens walked at the front of the prisoner column, often still wearing the regalia of their former power. This detail was absolutely crucial to the psychological impact. By displaying monarchs in their royal garments while they shuffled in chains, Rome created a visual paradox that burned itself into every observer's memory. Here was a queen who had commanded armies, now powerless before Rome's might. Here was a king who had ruled from a golden throne, now stumbling in shackles through foreign streets, while crowds jeered and celebrated. The contrast wasn't accidental, it was the entire point. These images traveled far beyond Rome's walls, carried by traders and diplomats to every corner of the known world. The message was unmistakable. No throne guaranteed safety. No kingdom stood beyond Rome's reach. No crown could protect you from the empire's wrath. For female captives of royal blood, the triumph meant something even more devastating. It meant enduring the gaze of tens of thousands while stripped of every shred of dignity. The route stretched from the Field of Mars through the Forum and up the Capitoline Hill. The procession moved deliberately slowly, ensuring spectators at every point could observe every detail, every expression of humiliation on the captives' faces. And here's what made it truly torturous. The captive queens didn't know if they would survive the day. Some prisoners would be released after the spectacle. Others would be led to execution before sunset. This uncertainty served as its own form of torture, forcing the defeated to contemplate their approaching fate with every step through celebrating streets. Would today be their last? Would they see another sunrise? The questions hung over them like an executioner's blade, suspended but never quite falling. The triumph served multiple strategic purposes. It demonstrated Roman military supremacy to potential allies who might be considering rebellion. It satisfied the population's craving for tangible proof of victory, and it provided a stage for the systematic degradation of those who had resisted Roman expansion. Every element was calculated, from the route to the timing to the placement of prisoners, all designed to maximize the psychological impact on both participants and witnesses. But no triumph in Roman history captured the intersection of wealth, power, and humiliation quite like the spectacle of Zenobia's march through Rome in 274 CE. Let's rewind to 272. Zenobia had achieved something almost unthinkable for a woman in the ancient world. She had carved out an independent empire in the East. After her husband's death, she had taken control of Palmyra and expanded its territory until it stretched from Egypt through Syria and into Anatolia. She challenged Roman authority across the eastern Mediterranean, minting coins with her image, declaring her son emperor and effectively creating a rival power center that Rome could not ignore. Emperor Aurelian, determined to restore imperial unity, marched east with his legions. The final confrontation came near Antioch, where Roman military discipline shattered Zenobia's forces. As her army collapsed, the queen fled, racing toward Persia and potential sanctuary. She almost made it. Roman cavalry caught her as she crossed the Euphrates, capturing the woman who had nearly split the empire in two. Aurelian now possessed something more valuable than gold, the perfect symbol for his upcoming triumph, and he intended to use it. The Historia Augusta, A collection of imperial biographies compiled in the 4th century provides us with vivid descriptions of what happened next. When Aurelian's triumphal procession wound through Rome in 274, Zenobia appeared as the centerpiece of the spectacle. But the details of her appearance reveal the calculated cruelty behind the display. She was adorned with jewels that caught the Mediterranean sunlight, her royal garments intact, transforming her into a glittering monument that represented all the wealth of the eastern kingdoms. Romans who had never seen such opulence gawked at the display, calculating the value of the tribute now flowing into their city. But it was the restraints that drew gasps from the crowd. Zenobia walked bound in chains made entirely of gold. Not simple golden-colored metal, but massive solid gold chains so heavy that guards marched beside her to help bear the weight. Think about this symbolism for a moment. These weren't chains designed merely to restrain. They were sculptural pieces, works of expensive craftsmanship that probably cost more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. The very wealth Zenobia had commanded was transformed into the instrument of her bondage. Her entire person had become a walking display of conquered riches, her body a canvas upon which Rome painted its dominance. The chains were so heavy she could barely walk. Ancient sources note she required assistance from guards who held the chain's weight while she moved. This physical burden forced her to move slowly, ensuring the crowds had ample time to observe every detail as she passed. Hour after hour she walked that 4-kilometer route, the golden chains gleaming in the sun, her former majesty twisted into a spectacle of submission. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Despite the weight of those chains, despite the jeering crowds, despite the calculated humiliation of her every step, Zenobia maintained her composure. Ancient historians remark on this with something approaching awe. She carried herself with dignity throughout the ordeal, her bearing suggesting that while Rome had conquered her kingdom, it had not broken her spirit. This defiance may have saved her life. Most captive rulers who appeared in Roman triumphs ended their day in the Mamertine prison, facing execution. But Aurelian made a different calculation. Perhaps impressed by her bearing, perhaps recognizing that her continued existence served his purposes better than her martyrdom, the emperor granted Zenobia something unexpected: life. She was given a villa near Tivoli, outside Rome. Some ancient sources claim she married a Roman senator and integrated into aristocratic society. Her daughters allegedly married into noble families, their Palmyran royal blood mixing with Roman patrician lineage. Whether this represented genuine mercy or a more subtle form of humiliation remains fiercely debated by historians. Consider what her continued existence meant. Every time a foreign diplomat visited Rome, every time an Eastern trader conducted business in Italy, they could potentially encounter the former queen of Palmyra living as a Roman dependent. She became a living monument to imperial power, her very presence a constant reminder that even the mightiest rulers could be reduced to subjects. Was this mercy? Or was it the cruelest punishment of all to survive your own defeat? To live as a symbol of your failure, to watch your empire's memory fade while you remained trapped in your conqueror's embrace? But if Zenobia's fate represented calculated mercy, what happened to Britain's Boudica and her daughters reveals the unrestrained brutality that Roman officials could inflict when they chose to abandon even the pretense of civilized conduct. The year was 60 C.I. King Prasutagus of the Iceni had just died, and he had crafted what he believed was a brilliant compromise. His will divided his kingdom, half to Emperor Nero, half to his 2 daughters. He hoped this arrangement would preserve Iceni independence while satisfying Roman demands for tribute. It was a careful balance negotiated with what Prasutagus must have thought was diplomatic wisdom. The Romans tore up the will before the ink was dry. Imperial Procurator Decius Cottus, the official charged with managing Roman financial interests in Britain, declared the entire Iceni kingdom forfeit. Soldiers seized lands, confiscated property, and began treating the Iceni as conquered enemies, despite their status as nominal Roman allies. When Boudica, now queen, protested this violation of her late husband's will and the wholesale theft of her people's property. She discovered exactly how little protection royal status offered. Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola served in Britain during this period, recorded what followed with unusual directness. Roman historians often used euphemisms when discussing violence against women, but Tacitus's account suggests so disturbing that even he, writing for an audience accustomed to brutal conquest, felt compelled to be explicit. Boudica was publicly flogged. Let that sink in for a moment. To flog a Roman citizen required legal justification, procedural safeguards, and even then was considered scandalous. To flog a queen of an allied kingdom, not an enemy captured in war, but an ally whose husband had cooperated with Rome, constituted an act of such deliberate humiliation that it suggests calculated policy rather than random violence. But the Romans went further. Boudica's daughters, likely teenagers and certainly unmarried, were violated by Roman soldiers. Tacitus places these assaults at the center of his explanation for what happened next, suggesting that even his Roman audience would understand them as crossing a line that separated acceptable conquest from unconscionable brutality. The abuse wasn't committed in secret. It was public, performed before the ICI people. This detail is crucial to understanding the strategy. By degrading the royal family in front of their subjects, Roman officials sent a message about the fate awaiting anyone who questioned imperial authority. The physical violation of Boudica and her daughters was designed to terrorize an entire population into submission, to break the psychological will to resist by demonstrating that not even royal blood offered protection. The strategy backfired catastrophically. Rather than crushing resistance, the abuse ignited a rebellion that nearly drove Rome from Britain entirely. Boudica raised an army that destroyed 3 Roman cities, Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, massacring tens of thousands of Roman citizens and their British allies. Tacitus preserves a speech he attributes to her, in which she declares that she fights not as a queen seeking to preserve her kingdom, but as an ordinary woman avenging her violated body and the destroyed honor of her daughters. The rebellion ended in a crushing defeat at an unknown battlefield. Roman discipline and tactical positioning overcame the far larger British forces. Tacitus claims Boudica poisoned herself rather than face capture, choosing death over the humiliation she had already endured, or worse treatment she knew awaited. And her daughters? They vanish from historical accounts after the initial violation. Their names, their fates, their very existence erased from the historical record. They become ghosts, their suffering acknowledged but their stories lost to silence. Which brings us to the darkest destination in any Roman triumph, the final stop for those who were not spared. As triumphal processions wound toward the Capitoline Hill and the Temple of Jupiter, condemned prisoners knew where their journey would truly end. The Mamertine prison, known in Latin as Tullianum, waited at the northeastern slope of the Capitoline. This ancient structure, still standing today in modern Rome, served as the final destination for Rome's most notable enemies. The architecture itself was designed for terror. The prison consisted of 2 levels. The upper chamber served as a holding cell, accessible through a door reasonably lit and marginally habitable. But beneath it lay the lower dungeon, reachable only through a hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered into this subterranean chamber, where darkness was absolute and the air thick with the stench of those who had died there before. No windows, no light, no hope. While triumph crowds celebrated in the streets above, condemned rulers were led aside and taken to the Tullianum. The methods of execution varied, but all were hidden from public view, occurring in the darkness while Rome feasted. Some prisoners were strangled. Others were left to starve. The process remained deliberately concealed, the final moments of Rome's enemies playing out in shadow while their defeat was celebrated in sunlight. Vercingetorix provides a haunting example. The Gallic chieftain who had united the tribes of Gaul against Julius Caesar was captured after the siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, but Caesar didn't execute him immediately. Instead, he kept the Gallic leader imprisoned for 6 full years before finally parading him through Rome in the triumph of 46 BCE. By then, the vigorous warrior who had nearly driven Rome from Gaul had deteriorated into a broken figure. After the procession, he was taken to the Tullianum and executed, his long captivity ending in the darkness beneath the Capitoline. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, met an even more brutal fate. After appearing in Marius's triumph in 104 BCE, the king was lowered into the Tullianum's lower chamber. Ancient accounts describe how he went mad with terror upon descending into the pit. He was left to starve to death over 6 days, his cries echoing through the stone walls while Rome celebrated above. The historian Plutarch recorded his final words, allegedly spoken in delirium. "How cold this Roman bath is." Whether these were his actual words or a later invention, they capture the psychological horror of the Tullianum dying slowly in the dark, abandoned and forgotten while your enemies feasted. Not every captive ruler faced immediate execution. The decision rested with the triumphant general or, under the empire, with the emperor himself. Some prisoners proved more valuable alive, serving as permanent symbols of Roman victory or as leverage in future negotiations. But for those marked for death, the triumph offered only a temporary reprieve, a final walk through sunlight before descent into the Tullianum's consuming darkness. So what does all of this reveal about power, about conquest, about the cost of empire? The treatment of captured queens by Roman soldiers exposes something fundamental about how authority operated in the ancient world. Legal systems that protected citizens evaporated at the boundaries of conquest. Dignity afforded to nobility dissolved the moment their armies fell. These aren't abstract historical curiosities, they're documented cases from Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and other ancient historians that force us to confront the calculated cruelty embedded in Roman expansion. The flogging of Boudica wasn't an aberration, it was policy. The golden chains on Zenobia weren't random cruelty, they were calculated symbolism. The executions following triumphs weren't necessary for security, they were theater, designed to break resistance and display power to audiences both present and distant. Consider how the systematic humiliation of defeated royalty shaped the fears that kept Rome's enemies compliant for centuries. Every queen who contemplated resistance had to weigh her chances not just of military defeat, but of surviving what came after. The prospect of walking in chains through Rome, of watching your dignity dismantled piece by piece before cheering crowds, of facing violation or execution or the subtler torment of living as a monument to your own failure. These possibilities hung over every decision to resist imperial expansion. The stone walls of the Mamertine prison still stand in Rome today, a reminder that the triumphs celebrated in ancient texts were built on human suffering. Queens who commanded armies and administered justice found themselves reduced to spectacles, their degradation transformed into entertainment for crowds who never considered the cost of empire written in broken lives and stolen dignity. These weren't anomalies in an otherwise civilized system. They were features carefully designed and ruthlessly implemented. Rome didn't just defeat its enemies, it unmade them, transforming rulers into warnings, crowns into chains, and defiance into cautionary tales that echoed across centuries. The next time you encounter the grandeur of Roman civilization, the architecture, the law, the cultural achievements that shaped Western history, remember the shattered crowns that paved the roads to that glory. Remember Zenobia and her golden chains. Remember Boudica and her vanished daughters. Remember the darkness of the Tullianum, where Rome's enemies met their end, while triumph processions celebrated above. Because understanding history means confronting not just the monuments that survived, but the voices that were silenced. Not just the glory of empire, but the human cost of its construction. These queens dared to challenge Rome, and Rome made certain their defeat would be remembered forever, not as they wished to be remembered, but as warnings of what awaited those who refused to submit. If this documentary opened your eyes to a darker chapter of ancient history, Subscribe for more deep investigations into the stories they don't teach in textbooks. Because the past isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the human beings who lived through them, who suffered through them, and whose experiences still have the power to teach us about the nature of power, the cost of empire, and the enduring question of what we're willing to do to those we consider our enemies. History isn't comfortable, but it's true, and truth is always worth pursuing, no matter how dark the shadows where it hides.